The ship that entered the Catharan system was small, embarrassingly small. The Galactic Dominion's forward fleet had been waiting for 17 standard hours, their weapons charged, their shields layered 3 deep, their commanders dressed in ceremonial armor designed specifically to intimidate lesser species into immediate submission. And what arrived was a single human vessel the size of a Dominion supply shuttle, painted an unremarkable gray, with a small flag attached to its hull by what appeared to be magnetic clips. The flag was white. Fleet Admiral Voskara stared at the display screen for a long moment. Then she stared some more. "Is that a surrender flag?" asked her second-in-command, Lieutenant Preth. "Humans use white flags to signal a desire to talk," said the ship's cultural interpreter, a nervous little Yillian who had spent 40 years studying human behavior and still found them deeply confusing. "It means they want to negotiate." "They sent one ship," Voskara said slowly. "One ship?" "Yes, Admiral. To negotiate with the 17th Fleet." "It appears so." The 17th Fleet consisted of 400 warships. It had reduced 3 planetary civilizations to rubble in the last decade alone. Its flagship, the Eternal Dominion, was longer than some human cities. And a single gray shuttle with a magnetic flag had just pulled up alongside it and was, apparently, hailing them. Voskara took a slow breath. "Put them through." The face that appeared on screen was human, which meant it was unsettling in the particular way all human faces were. Too flat, too expressive, the eyes moving constantly, the mouth doing things that didn't map cleanly onto any emotional language the Dominion had cataloged. The human was male, older, with gray at his temples and a calm expression that Voskara immediately distrusted. He wore no uniform, just a dark jacket, open at the collar. He looked like someone who had stopped for a conversation, not someone facing down 400 warships. "Admiral Voskara," the human said pleasantly. "My name is David Hale. I've been authorized by the United Earth Council to represent humanity in these discussions. Thank you for agreeing to meet." Voskara had not agreed to anything. She had simply answered the hail. She decided not to mention this. "Mr. Hale," she said carefully, "you are aware of the nature of this meeting?" "Completely," David said, nodding. "You're here to formalize Earth's surrender. You've given us the standard 72-hour window. We have about," he glanced at something off-screen, "6 hours left. And you sent one ship." "I only need one ship," he said, without any particular pride in his voice. Just a statement of fact, like someone mentioning the weather. "I also brought lunch, if that's appropriate. I wasn't sure about Catharan dietary customs. I have sandwiches. And coffee. Do you drink coffee?" There was a silence on the bridge that lasted several seconds too long. "We do not drink coffee," Voskara said. "Shame. It's excellent. We can set that aside." He folded his hands on the table in front of him. "Shall we begin?" The Dominion's terms were not complicated, because they were never meant to be complicated. They were meant to be absolute. Humanity would cede all territorial claims beyond their home system. Earth would become a protectorate, which was a polite word for a controlled colony. Human technology, and the Dominion had been watching human technological development with increasing unease for the past 30 years, would be submitted for review, cataloged, and where necessary, suppressed. Humans would be permitted to live, work, and travel within Dominion space, but under permit systems and population controls. In exchange, the Dominion would not bombard Earth into a cooling rock. David listened to all of this without interrupting. He had a small notepad in front of him, and he wrote things down occasionally, which the Dominion officers found strange. Who wrote things down by hand anymore? But he wrote, and nodded, and when Voskara's legal attaché finished reading the terms, David looked up. "Okay," he said. "So those are your opening terms." "Those are our final terms," the attaché said stiffly. Right, David said, in a way that made it clear he had not absorbed this framing at all. "Can I ask a few questions before we continue?" Nobody had ever asked questions before. Surrender negotiations did not typically involve questions. Voskara found herself nodding before she had consciously decided to. "The suppression of human technology," David said, flipping back a page in his notepad. "That's item 7. Can you be more specific about what that means? Because we've got a lot of technology. Are we talking about weapons? Because I understand that concern. Or are you talking about, say, our faster-than-light communication arrays? Our terraforming engines? The Nakamura drive?" "All of it," the attaché said. All technology above a threshold level will be reviewed. Reviewed by whom? The Dominion Science Council. How long does a review take? The attaché paused. It varies. Ballpark. Decades, in some cases. So in the meantime, no human ships using the Nakamura drive. Correct. David nodded slowly, writing something down. And the Nakamura drive is what lets us move supplies to our outer colonies. The ones that can't sustain themselves without those supply runs. So during the decades-long review period, those colonies would. He left the sentence unfinished, which was somehow worse than finishing it. Voskera knew the answer. The colonies would starve. She had known this, in a vague way, when the terms were being drafted. It had not seemed like a problem at the time, because the Dominion did not particularly care what happened to human colonies. But sitting here, with David Hale writing in his small notepad and not raising his voice or making threats, the knowledge felt different. Heavier. I'm not saying that to be dramatic, David added. I'm genuinely trying to understand the terms. It's hard to sign something you don't understand. The terms are not open for interpretation, the attaché said. Everything is open for interpretation, David said pleasantly. That's actually the foundational truth of all language. But let's move on. Item 12, the population controls. How does that work, specifically? The next 2 hours proceeded in this fashion. David did not argue. He did not threaten. He did not invoke human military strength, which was considerable, or human stubbornness, which was legendary, or the 17 automated defense platforms now quietly repositioning themselves along the Dominion fleet's blind angles. A fact that Voskera's tactical officer had noticed and was trying to figure out how to raise without causing a diplomatic incident. David simply asked questions. Specific ones. Quiet ones. The kind of questions that required the Dominion's representatives to actually think about what their terms meant when applied to living people in real situations. By the third hour, 2 of the legal attaches were arguing quietly with each other about the definition of a word in Item 4. By the 4th hour, the cultural interpreter had excused himself to go lie down. By the 5th hour, Voskera found herself staring at the terms she had carried across 17 light years and realizing, for the first time, that 3 of them directly contradicted each other. David had pointed this out 40 minutes ago, gently, with his notepad. I think, he said, during a pause in the discussion, that what would be helpful is if we drafted a clearer framework. Something that actually defines terms, establishes timelines, accounts for third-party dependencies. I can have my team draw something up overnight. Nothing binding. Just a working document. We did not come here for a working document, Voskera said. No, David agreed. You came here for a surrender. I understand that. He looked at her steadily. I just want to make sure that if Earth does surrender, it's to terms that mean something. Wouldn't you want the same? A surrender that actually holds, that doesn't collapse into conflict in 5 years because nobody defined what protectorate meant. Voskera stared at him for a long moment. She had been in the military for 43 years. She had overseen the collapse of civilizations. She had sat across tables from species that wept and species that raged and species that simply went silent as they signed their names. She had never sat across from someone who talked about her conquest like it was a first draft of a mutual agreement. You have 6 hours remaining, she said finally. David smiled. It was a very calm smile. Then we'd better get back to it, he said, and opened his notepad to a fresh page. The 6 hours passed. Then another 6. Then a full standard day. Nobody in the Dominion fleet quite knew how to address this. The surrender window had technically expired. Protocol was clear. When a species failed to submit within the designated period, bombardment commenced. Voskera had done it before. She had given the order while drinking her morning tea broth, calm as a stone, because the species in question had spent their final hours singing war songs that were more brave than tactical. But she had not given the order this time, and she was having a difficult time explaining to herself exactly why. David Hale was still on the screen. He had slept, apparently just leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for 4 hours while his small team of 3 other humans worked on what he called the framework document. He had woken up, eaten something wrapped in paper that smelled, through the environmental sensors, aggressively good, and resumed where he had left off. The framework document was now 47 pages. You can't be serious, said Commander Reth, Voskera's tactical officer, staring at the document that had been transmitted to their systems. He scrolled through it with the expression of someone finding an unexpected animal in their bed. They wrote 47 pages overnight. For a surrender. It's not a surrender document, said the cultural interpreter, who had returned from lying down looking no better than before. I'm not sure what it is. A negotiation framework. We are not negotiating, Reth said. Apparently we are, Voskera said. She had been reading the document for the past hour. It was organized, precise, and deeply irritating, because it was also undeniably reasonable. Every clause was balanced. Every term was defined. There were appendices. There were timelines with built-in review periods. There was even a section titled Dispute Resolution Mechanisms that laid out a process for handling conflicts arising from interpretation of the agreement, something no surrender document in Dominion history had ever included, because the Dominion had always assumed that any disputes arising from a surrender would be resolved by the Dominion, using whatever method the Dominion preferred, usually involving weapons. The document didn't argue against Dominion authority. It just quietly, persistently, and very specifically described what that authority would look like in practice. And in practice, it looked complicated. It looked expensive. It looked like something that would require significant Dominion administrative resources to manage across multiple human systems, indefinitely, with no clear endpoint. Admiral, Reth said quietly, we should begin the bombardment sequence. I'm aware. The delay is already unusual. High Command will notice. I'm aware of that too. She kept reading. Page 31 contained a section on what David had called administrative burden assessment, a careful, footnoted analysis of what it would actually cost the Dominion to enforce the terms they had proposed. Not in moral terms, not in ethical argument, but in pure logistics. Ships needed to maintain oversight of human shipping lanes. Personnel required to staff the review councils for human technology. Resources allocated to population monitoring across 14 human colony worlds. It was all there, itemized, with projected costs and standard Dominion credits. The number at the bottom of the page was very large. David hadn't argued that the Dominion couldn't afford it. He had simply presented the number, labeled it Year 1 Projected Implementation Cost, and moved on. But the number sat there on the page like a stone in a smooth road. When Voskera rejoined the live channel, David was talking with one of his team members in low voices. He looked up when she appeared and gave her the same calm, attentive expression he had maintained for over 30 hours without any apparent deterioration. Admiral, he said. Good morning. Or evening. I've lost track, honestly. Mr. Hale, she said. High Command is asking why the surrender has not been finalized. What did you tell them? She paused. That the terms were being clarified. Something crossed his face. Not a smirk. Not quite, but something adjacent to it. Controlled. That's accurate, he said. We are clarifying terms. Page 31 has a few figures I'd like to walk through if you have time. I've read page 31. Then you've seen the year 1 figure. I have. There was a pause. David let the pause breathe, which Voskera was beginning to understand was a deliberate technique. He didn't rush to fill silence. Most species did. Silence felt like threat, like failure, like something that needed to be corrected. David seemed to find silence comfortable, even useful. I want to be clear, he said finally, that I'm not presenting this to argue that the Dominion can't do it. I'm sure you can. I'm presenting it so we all understand what we're agreeing to. A surrender should be sustainable. For both sides. You keep saying that, Voskera said. Because it keeps being true. He leaned forward slightly. The last species you did this to, the Verity, they surrendered. Signed your standard terms. And 4 years later you had to send in a punitive fleet because the administration of their surrender had collapsed under its own complexity. We both know how that ended. Voskera said nothing. The Verity system was still largely uninhabitable. I'm not interested in that outcome, David said. Earth can't afford it, and, frankly, neither can you. Not again. He paused. So what I'd like to propose, and this is entirely Earth's suggestion, you're free to reject it, is an alternative structure. He pulled up a new page, a single page, clean and simple, with 6 points on it. Voskera read it. Then read it again. It was not a surrender. It was not an alliance either. It was something else, a framework for what David called structured integration, in which Earth would acknowledge Dominion primacy in galactic affairs, contribute resources and personnel to Dominion initiatives, accept Dominion arbitration in territorial disputes, and in exchange maintain autonomy over internal governance, technological development, and colonial administration. It looked, from a distance, like Earth was agreeing to come work for the Dominion. It also looked, from a slightly different angle, like Earth was agreeing to almost nothing the original terms had demanded, while using language that could, technically, be reported to High Command as a successful capitulation. "You have a word for this on Earth," the cultural interpreter said quietly from behind Voskera's chair. She hadn't realized he was reading over her shoulder. "Judo. Using the weight of your opponent's expectations against them." "He's not fighting," Voskera said. "No," the interpreter agreed. "He's just repositioning things. Very gently. Until the ground is somewhere else." The tactical display chimed softly. Reth turned to it, and his expression changed in a way that made Voskera stand up. "Admiral," he said, "sensors are picking up something." The holographic display expanded to show the wider system. Around the edges of the Ketharan system's outer boundary, casually, with no weapons active, broadcasting full identification signals as if they had every right to be there, 17 human vessels had appeared. Not warships, technically, designated as research and survey vessels. But Voskera had spent 40 years in naval command, and she knew the profile of a ship that had been built for one purpose and labeled for another. They weren't pointed at the fleet. They weren't doing anything threatening. They were simply there, doing what David had described as routine survey operations in the region. "When did they arrive?" Voskera asked. Reth checked. "They've been here for 9 hours, Admiral." They were running silent. "They activated their identification beacons about 4 minutes ago." She turned back to the screen. David was watching her with the same calm expression. "Those are survey ships," he said, before she could speak. "They've been there since before you arrived," she said. "Yes," he agreed simply. "You planned this before you even boarded your shuttle." He tilted his head slightly. "I planned several things," he said. "None of them are threats. I just believe in understanding the full picture of a situation before making decisions. I'd imagine you do too." The full picture of the situation, Voskera was beginning to understand, was considerably larger and more carefully composed than it had appeared when a small gray shuttle with a magnetic flag had shown up outside her fleet. David Hale had arrived alone. He had brought sandwiches. He had asked quiet questions and written things in a notepad and smiled politely across 30 hours of conversation. And somewhere underneath all of that, like the deep architecture of a structure you only see when you look at it from exactly the right angle, was something that was not negotiation and was not surrender and was not war. It was something that didn't quite have a name in Dominion vocabulary, which might have been the point. Voskera sat back down. She looked at the 6 points on the clean single page. "I'll need to send this to High Command," she said. "Of course," David said. "Take all the time you need." He refilled his coffee cup. He opened his notepad, and he waited with the patient, easy stillness of someone who already knew how the next part went. High Command's response arrived in 12 minutes. This was fast, unusually fast, which told Voskera that someone very senior was watching this particular engagement very closely. The message was marked with the personal seal of Supreme Commander Tathvon himself, which had happened to Voskera exactly once before in her career, and the previous time had involved a situation with an exploding moon. The message was brief. It said, *, do not sign anything. We are sending a delegation. *, the delegation arrived in 31 hours. 3 heavy cruisers, a diplomatic vessel, and a ship that Voskera recognized as the personal transport of Arbitrator General Sovakan, the Dominion's most senior diplomatic authority, a figure who had personally overseen the submission of 11 civilizations and who was, by wide consensus, the most intimidating person in galactic politics. She was 7 feet tall, had 4 arms, had outlived 3 supreme commanders, and her species communicated dominance through a subsonic frequency that made other species feel instinctively small. She had never lost a negotiation. This was partly because the Dominion's definition of negotiation involved bringing 400 warships, but still, her record was perfect. David Hale, when informed of the delegation's arrival, said, "Wonderful," and asked if anyone wanted more coffee. His team had apparently brought a great deal of it. The meeting shifted to the diplomatic vessel, which was large enough to seat 30 comfortably. Sovakan arrived with 12 aides, 3 translators, a legal team of 6, and an advisor whose specific role nobody explained. She settled into her chair, specially constructed for her species, and looked across the table at David Hale, who was alone except for one young woman with a laptop and an older man who appeared to be asleep. The man who appeared to be asleep was Dr. James Okafor, who had a doctorate in xenopolitical economics and had been the primary author of the 47-page framework document. He had a gift for looking completely disengaged at the exact moments when he was most attentive. Sovakon activated the subsonic frequency. David blinked, glanced up as if noticing a slight change in air pressure, and then looked at Sovakon with polite interest. "Arbitrator General," he said, "it's a genuine honor. I've read all your published works." Sovakon had published 2 papers on intergalactic law, both of them restricted documents. She stared at him. "Those are not publicly available." "No." David agreed pleasantly and said nothing further. She leaned forward. "Mr. Hale, I will be direct. The Dominion is aware of what you have been doing. The questions, the document, the repositioning of language. We have seen similar tactics before, from species who believe cleverness could substitute for strength. It cannot. And I want to be clear, I am not here to negotiate. I am here to close." "I understand," David said, "and I respect that position. Can I show you something first?" He nodded to the young woman with the laptop. She turned the screen toward the Dominion delegation. On it was a star map, not the standard Dominion cartographic format, but something with different overlays, different color coding, representing the galaxy in a way the Dominion officers hadn't quite seen before. "This is what we call the dependency map," David said. "My team put it together. It shows supply chain relationships across Dominion space. Not military supply chains, economic ones. Trade routes, resource flows, raw material dependencies." He stood and walked to the screen, pointing with one finger. "This cluster here is the Keth systems. Major agricultural output. Feeds about 30% of the Dominion's core worlds. These lines show where the food goes." He traced them. "Now here, these are the shipping companies that actually move the food. 11 of them. 7 of those 11 companies use a logistics coordination system called the Varis network." He glanced back at the table. "Does anyone know who built the Varis network?" Silence. "Human engineers. Contracted by the Keth Agricultural Consortium 12 years ago. The system runs on human-designed architecture. If you look here," he zoomed in, "the core processing nodes are maintained by a company called Helix Logistics, headquartered in Geneva, Earth." He straightened up. "Now, I'm not saying anything about what would or wouldn't happen to the Varis network under various circumstances. I'm just showing you what it looks like when you trace the dependencies." Dr. Okafor, who had been apparently asleep, spoke without opening his eyes. 43% of Dominion's shipping infrastructure at the coordination layer involves human-built or human-maintained systems. That number has grown by 9% in the last 4 years. At current rates, it reaches majority in about 6 years. He opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling thoughtfully. The Dominion didn't plan for this, of course. Nobody really plans for it. You just needed reliable logistics systems, and humans kept building the best ones, and the contracts kept getting signed. The room was very quiet. Sovakon's 4 hands were very still on the table, which Voskura, watching from the side, knew was not a good sign. The arbitrator general was thinking hard, and she was not someone who enjoyed being made to think hard in front of an audience. "You're describing a leverage position," Sovakon said. "I'm describing a factual situation," David said. "I want to be precise about that. I'm not making threats. I'm not saying that anything bad would happen to these systems. Helix Logistics will continue to do excellent work regardless of the outcome of these discussions. They have contracts. They honor contracts." He returned to his seat. "But I do think it's useful for everyone at this table to understand the full picture before we make decisions." He picked up his coffee cup. "Because the full picture is that humanity has not, actually, been sitting still for the past 30 years. We've been doing what we do, building things, solving problems, signing contracts. And some of those things turned out to be fairly important pieces of how larger systems function." The Dominion legal team was conferring in rapid whispers. One of them was pulling up data on a tablet, cross-referencing something, and the expression on his face was not good news for anyone who wanted this meeting to go quickly. "You're saying," Sovakon said carefully, "that Earth cannot be removed from galactic commerce without significant disruption." "I'm saying it's worth knowing," David said. I'm saying that whoever signs something in this room today should understand what they're actually signing. That's all I've ever been saying. Sovakon looked at him for a long moment. Her subsonic frequency had stopped some time ago. Voskera wasn't sure when. The effect of it had simply faded as the conversation continued, crowded out by more pressing things. What do you want? The arbitrator general asked. Not the formal diplomatic question, not the procedural opener, the real one. Flat and direct. David set down his coffee cup. He looked at his notepad, then back up at her. I want humanity to be able to grow, he said. Expand. Build. Keep signing contracts and solving problems. I want our colonies to be safe and our ships to fly without being stopped and searched. I want our scientists to publish and our engineers to engineer and our doctors to go where they're needed. He paused. I want Earth to have a seat in the conversations that affect it. Not control. Not dominance. A seat. That's not how the Dominion functions, Sovakon said. I know, David said. I think that could change. He slid a single sheet across the table. The same 6 points. Clean and simple, with one addition at the bottom. A clause proposing a formal human advisory position within the Dominion's Economic Governance Council, a body that set policy for exactly the kind of trade and logistics infrastructure David had just spent an hour describing. Sovakon looked at it. Her legal team looked at it. Voskera looked at it from across the room. It was still not a surrender. It was also not quite an alliance. It was something that would look, from High Command's perspective, like a controlled integration. Humanity formally acknowledging Dominion primacy, agreeing to share intelligence on their logistics systems, contributing resources to Dominion priorities. And it was something that would look, from Earth's perspective, like gaining a permanent voice in the council that governed 40% of the galaxy's economic framework. Both of those things were true at the same time. David had written it, so they were both true at the same time. You're going to keep doing this until we agree to something, Sovakon said. I'm going to keep talking, David said. That's what I was sent here to do. Sovakon picked up the sheet. She read it again slowly, with the attention of someone hoping to find a flaw they had previously missed. Her 4 hands held the paper flat and still. Outside the viewport, very far away, but visible on the sensors, the 17 human survey ships continued their routine operations, peaceful and unhurried, going about their business in the calm and patient way of people who had all the time in the world. The document was signed on the 4th day. Not the original surrender terms. Those had been quietly set aside somewhere around hour 10 of the discussions, never formally withdrawn, simply never mentioned again, like a rude comment that everyone in the room had agreed to collectively forget. What was signed was a 14-page agreement that the Dominion's press office would describe as a historic integration compact formalizing humanity's structured inclusion within the Galactic Dominion's administrative framework, and that Earth's Council would describe as a landmark partnership establishing human advisory rights in galactic governance. Both descriptions were accurate. This had been intentional. Arbitrator General Sovakon signed with 3 of her 4 hands, which was traditional for her species in moments of great significance. She did it with the composed expression of someone who had made a decision they were confident in and was not thinking too hard about all the steps that had led there. David Hale signed with a ballpoint pen, which was not traditional for anything, but which he had apparently carried in his jacket pocket for the entirety of the 4 days and was not going to stop using now. There was a brief silence after the signing. The kind of silence that fills a room when something has happened that everyone present understands is important, but nobody is quite sure how to measure. Sovakon spoke first. I want to be direct with you, Mr. Hale. Please, David said. What you did here, the questions, the documents, the dependency maps, the careful repositioning of every term. I have never seen it done quite this way. I have dealt with species who stalled, species who misled, species who fought, or wept, or bargained desperately. You did none of those things. You came in very quietly, and you just kept making the situation more complex until the original situation no longer existed. David considered this. That's a fair description. How long did you plan it? The framework document took about 8 months. The dependency map took 2 years. The survey ships were already doing their work. That part wasn't staged. They really are survey ships. I just made sure we knew exactly where they were. He paused. The notepad was genuinely just because I think better when I write things down. Something shifted in Sovakon's expression. Not softness. Exactly. It was not a face built for softness, but something like involuntary respect, the kind that arrives before your pride has had time to object. Your species, she said, prepared for this for 2 years. For longer than that, David said. We've been watching Dominion expansion patterns for about 15 years. We knew this conversation was coming. We just needed to make sure we had something useful to say when it arrived. He stood, gathered his notepad, and capped his pen. Humanity spent a long time being afraid of the Dominion. And then we spent some time being angry. And then a group of very tired, very practical people sat in a room on Earth and said, what if we just worked the problem? Not emotionally, not militarily, just worked it, the way you'd work any problem that seems too big, which is to break it into smaller pieces and deal with each piece honestly. He looked at Sovakan. You asked what we wanted. We want to still exist in 100 years. We want our children to be able to go somewhere. We want to matter in the larger story of what happens in this galaxy. He shrugged slightly. That's not unreasonable. And it turned out the best way to pursue it was not to fight the Dominion, but to make ourselves genuinely useful to it. Hard to destroy something that 40% of your logistics infrastructure depends on. Sovakan made a sound that was the Dominion equivalent of a dry laugh. Deliberately, very deliberately, David agreed. We're good at building things. We're good at solving problems. We're good at finding the efficient path through complicated systems. We've been doing it on Earth for a long time. It turns out those skills translate. He extended his hand. After a brief pause, Sovakan had learned human greeting customs, but had never actually performed one before. She took it, carefully, with one of her 4 hands, and they shook once. The signing room cleared slowly. Aides gathered documents. Legal teams exchanged contact protocols. Voskara stood near the door, watching the room empty, and when David Hale walked past her she said, quietly, Admiral, because she found she didn't know what else to say. He stopped. Fleet Admiral. She looked at him for a moment. Outside, through the ship's viewport, the 17th Fleet was still arranged in its imposing formation, 400 warships, weapons charged, shields layered, representing the accumulated military might of an empire that spanned hundreds of systems. He had arrived in a shuttle. He had brought a notepad and sandwiches. And the outcome of this meeting was not what the fleet had been sent here to produce. You knew when you boarded that shuttle, she said. You knew how this would go. I knew how I wanted it to go, he said. I spent 2 years making sure the conditions were right for it to go that way. Those are different things. But you weren't afraid. He smiled at that, a different smile from the calm, patient one he had maintained through 4 days of discussion. This one was smaller and more honest. I was terrified, he said. I'm still a little terrified. 400 warships is a lot of warships. But fear and action aren't mutually exclusive. You just have to give the action somewhere to go. He nodded once, politely, and walked out. Voskara stood for a moment longer, then followed. The news traveled faster than any of them. By the time the delegation ships began their return journey, it had already spread through diplomatic back channels across the galaxy. Not the official version, not the press release language about historic compacts and structured integration, but the real version, the one that traveled the way real things always travel, person to person, in lowered voices, with a kind of disbelieving wonder attached to it. The Dominion had arrived to collect a surrender. A human had shown up alone, with sandwiches, and 4 days later the Dominion had agreed to give humanity a permanent advisory seat in its Economic Governance Council. In the trading stations along the Dominion's outer rim, in the diplomatic lounges of neutral systems, in the communications networks of 17 different species who had their own complicated relationships with Dominion power, the story was told and retold and argued about and embellished. Some species said the human must have been concealing weapons. Some said he must have used some kind of psychological manipulation, a human technique, poorly understood, that made other species feel things without knowing why. The Yilian cultural interpreter, when asked to comment, said only that he needed more time to process what he had witnessed before he could describe it accurately. He had been saying this for 3 weeks and still hadn't stopped. The version that stuck, the one that was still being repeated in those same trading stations and diplomatic lounges years later, was simpler than the reality. It said, the Dominion came to take Earth's surrender, and the human who showed up said, let's just talk about it first, and by the time they were done talking, Nobody could quite explain how they had ended up where they were. It was not an entirely accurate version. David Hale would have been the first to say so. The 2 years of preparation, the dependency maps, the survey ships, the precisely constructed framework document, the carefully selected sequence of questions, none of those things were present in the simple version. It had not been magic. It had not been charisma. It had been work, enormous amounts of very specific and intentional work, done by practical people who had decided that the most useful thing they could do was understand the problem thoroughly before attempting to solve it. But accurate or not, the simple version spread. And in the simple version, a human sat down across from the most powerful military force in the known galaxy with a notepad and a cup of coffee, and when they demanded his civilization's surrender, he said, very politely, "Can we talk about what that means first?" And the galaxy, somehow, could not figure out how to say no. On Earth, David Hale returned to a small debriefing that lasted 11 hours, submitted 3 reports, and went home. He slept for 14 hours, which he had not done in approximately 2 weeks. When he woke up, his daughter had left a note on the kitchen table that said she had seen the news and was proud of him, and also there was no coffee left because she'd used the last of it. He went to the shop, bought more coffee, and made himself a cup. He stood at his kitchen window and drank it slowly and watched a bird land on the fence outside and fly away again. The galaxy had been changed. Not loudly, not with fire and explosions and legendary battles that would be carved into monuments. Quietly, at a table, with 4 days, a notepad, and the patient willingness to understand a problem before deciding it was unsolvable. On 17 Dominion worlds, human logistics engineers were already being called back to service. On the Economic Governance Council, a new seat was being prepared. In deep space, the Nakamura drive hummed in the cores of human ships that had never stopped moving, never stopped building, never stopped going further and farther out into a galaxy that was larger than any one empire could truly hold. Humanity had not won a war. It had done something older than war and quieter, and in the long view, considerably more lasting. It had sat down. It had asked questions. It had made itself understood. And the galaxy, for once, had listened.